I never meant to fall in love with a dying man, but fate, I have learned, cares nothing for what we intend. My name is Clara Whitmore, and I came to Ashworth Hall in the autumn of 1847, when the leaves had turned to copper and the Yorkshire winds carried the first whispers of winter. I was 23 years old, the daughter of a schoolteacher and the granddaughter of a woman the village called a healer, though others used less kind words. I had been educated beyond my station, my father insisted, and when consumption took both my parents within a single cruel winter, I found myself alone in a world that had little use for a poor girl with too many books and too few connections. The position at Ashworth Hall was secured through a distant cousin who worked in the kitchens of a great London house, a companion for Lady Margaret, the 6-year-old niece of the Duke of Ashworth. The child had lost her mother to childbed fever and her father to grief shortly after, leaving her in the care of an uncle who, by all accounts, had no idea what to do with a small girl who cried for her mama in the night. I remember the first time I saw the estate, how my breath caught in my throat as the carriage crested the hill, and the great house revealed itself against the gray October sky. Ashworth Hall was a monument to generations of wealth and power, its stone facade stretching endlessly, its windows gleaming like watchful eyes. I clutched my small bag of belongings and wondered what place a girl from the Yorkshire hills could possibly have in such a world. The housekeeper, Mrs. Pemberton, met me at the servants' entrance with a face that suggested she had already formed her opinion of me and found it wanting. She led me through a labyrinth of corridors, past kitchens that hummed with activity and staircases that disappeared into shadows until we reached the nursery wing. There, in a room painted pale blue with curtains of white lace, I met Lady Margaret. She was a solemn child with dark hair and darker eyes, sitting perfectly still on a window seat with a wooden doll clutched to her chest. She did not smile when I entered. She did not speak. She simply watched me with the wary gaze of a creature that had learned too young that the people she loved could vanish without warning. It took 3 weeks before she spoke my name, a month before she reached for my hand during a thunderstorm. 2 months before she laughed at a story I told her about a rabbit who wanted to be a duchess. By Christmas, she had begun to heal, and I had begun to love her as though she were my own. But this story is not about Margaret, though she is woven through it like a golden thread. This story is about her uncle, the Duke of Ashworth, and the night I saved his life. Edward Ashworth was 28 years old when I came to his house, and he was everything the gossips claimed him to be: cold, distant, utterly devoted to duty. I would see him sometimes in the corridors, a tall figure in impeccable black, his dark hair swept back from a face that might have been carved from marble. He had the look of a man who carried weights invisible to others, whose shoulders bore responsibilities that had been placed upon them before he was ready to accept them. He rarely visited the nursery. When he did, he stood in the doorway like a man uncertain of his welcome, watching Margaret with an expression I could not read. He would ask after her health, her studies, her happiness, and then he would retreat back to his library or his study or whatever room it was, where dukes spent their endless hours managing estates and fortunes and the expectations of an entire lineage. I should have resented him for his absence in his niece's life. Perhaps I did, at first. But there was something in the way he paused outside the nursery door, something in the way his hand would rise as though to knock before falling back to his side, that made me wonder if his distance was not coldness, but fear. Fear of loving a child who had already lost so much. Fear of becoming another person who would eventually leave her. The servants spoke of him in hushed tones, as servants do. They said he had been different once, before his brother died, before the title and its burdens fell upon him. They said he had laughed easily, that he had been known to dance at balls and flirt with debutantes and ride his horse across the moors with reckless abandon. But grief had changed him, as it changes us all, and the man who remained was a shadow of the one who had been. I learned to read his moods by the sound of his footsteps in the hall, Quick and purposeful meant he was occupied with business and would not linger. Slow and hesitant meant he was fighting with himself about whether to see Margaret. There were nights when I would hear him pause outside the nursery long after the child had fallen asleep, and I would hold my breath in the darkness, wondering if he would enter, wondering what I would say if he did. He never did. Not then. The winter of 1848 arrived with a ferocity that took the household by surprise. Snow fell for days without ceasing, piling against the windows and trapping us all within the great stone walls of Ashworth Hall. Margaret delighted in the white world outside, pressing her small hands against the frost-covered glass and begging me to take her out to build a snow castle. I promised her we would, when the storm had passed, and she accepted my promise with the trust of a child who had learned to believe in me. It was during this storm that the fever came. It began, as such things often do, with nothing more than a chill. The Duke had been out riding before the worst of the snow, attending to some matter on the far edge of the estate, and he had returned wet and shivering, dismissing the concerns of his valet with the impatience of a man who had never been seriously ill a day in his life. By evening, he was coughing. By the next morning, he could not rise from his bed. The household doctor was summoned, a portly man named Dr. Hensley, who had served the Ashworth family for 30 years. He examined the Duke with furrowed brow and prescribed rest, hot broth, and a tincture of willow bark. The Duke would recover, he assured the Dowager Duchess, Lady Ashworth, who had descended upon her son's chambers with the imperious concern of a woman who controlled everything except death itself. These things simply needed time. But time, it seemed, was not on our side. 3 days passed, and the fever did not break. It climbed higher, burning through the Duke's body with a hunger that nothing could satisfy. He became delirious, calling out names I did not recognize, thrashing against the sheets that were changed hourly because they were soaked with sweat. Dr. Hensley sent for colleagues from London, men with grave faces and impressive credentials, who arrived in spite of the snow and gathered around the Duke's bed like crows around carrion. I watched from the periphery, as servants do, bringing fresh linens and basins of cool water, lingering in doorways when I should have been elsewhere. Margaret had been told her uncle was unwell, but not how unwell, and I spent my days distracting her with stories and games while my nights were consumed with listening for news from the sick room. It was on the 5th night that I heard the words that changed everything. I had crept down to the kitchens for warm milk to help Margaret sleep, and I passed the library where the doctors had gathered with the Dowager Duchess. The door was not fully closed, and their voices carried into the corridor with the clarity of a death knell. "There is nothing more we can do," one of the London physicians was saying. His voice was heavy with the resignation of a man who had accepted defeat. "The fever has progressed beyond the reach of modern medicine. We have tried everything: bloodletting, blistering, every tincture and compound known to science. His constitution is strong, which is why he has lasted this long, but I fear it is only a matter of days now, perhaps hours." The Dowager Duchess made a sound I had never heard from her before, something between a gasp and a sob, quickly stifled. "My son," she whispered, "my only remaining son. I am deeply sorry, Your Grace. We have done all that can be done." I stood frozen in the corridor, the pitcher of milk growing cold in my hands, and I felt something crack open inside my chest. I had not known until that moment how much I had come to care for the Duke, not as a master or an employer, but as a man. A man who paused outside nursery doors, a man who carried grief like a stone in his pocket, a man who was dying while I stood helpless in a hallway. And then, like a voice from another world, I heard my grandmother's words. She had died when I was 15, my grandmother, the healer of the Yorkshire hills. She had taught me everything she knew about the plants that grew wild in the moorland, the roots and leaves and flowers that could cure what physicians could not. She had shown me how to brew teas that eased pain, poultices that drew out infection, and one remedy in particular that she called her fever breaker. It was a combination of elderflower, yarrow, and peppermint, steeped in honey and administered every hour until the fever surrendered. The physicians would never have approved. They called such remedies peasant nonsense, the superstitions of uneducated country folk. The Dowager Duchess herself had forbidden any treatment that did not come from a licensed doctor, her pride in her family name extending even to the methods by which that family was kept alive. But the doctors had given up. They had spoken the words that meant they had no more weapons in their arsenal. And I knew, with a certainty that bordered on madness, that my grandmother's remedy could work where their science had failed. I did not sleep that night. I lay in my narrow bed in the servants' quarters and stared at the ceiling and argued with myself until dawn began to lighten the edges of the curtains. Who was I to challenge the greatest medical minds in England? Who was I to risk the Duke's life on the teachings of a village healer? If I was wrong, if the remedy failed or made things worse, I would be dismissed without reference. I would be ruined. I might even face charges of some kind for interfering with the treatment of a peer. But if I did nothing, he would die. I rose before the household stirred and made my way to the kitchen garden, where I knew the herbs I needed still grew beneath the snow. My hands were numb by the time I had gathered what I required, but my heart was burning with a resolve I had never felt before. I returned to the kitchens and brewed the remedy in secret, using a small pot hidden behind the larger ones, working quickly before the cook arrived to begin breakfast preparations. The liquid that resulted was pale gold and fragrant, smelling of summer meadows and my grandmother's cottage, and everything I had lost and everything I had learned. I poured it into a small flask and tucked it into my apron, and then I did something I had never done before. I went to the Duke's chambers. The footman stationed at the door looked at me with confusion. The doctors had retired for what rest they could manage, and only the valet remained inside, dozing in a chair beside the bed. I told the footman I had been sent to relieve the valet, that Mrs. Pemberton had arranged it, and whether it was my tone or his exhaustion or simply the chaos of a household in crisis, he let me pass. The room was dim, lit only by the fire that crackled in the hearth and a single candle on the bedside table. The air was thick with the smell of sickness and medicine, and beneath it, the faint scent of the man himself, something clean and sharp that reminded me of pine forests after rain. And there, in the great canopied bed, lay the Duke of Ashworth. He was so still that for one terrible moment I thought I had come too late. But then I saw the shallow rise and fall of his chest beneath the sweat-soaked sheets, and I moved closer, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain it would wake the valet. He looked younger in illness, the severity of his features softened by fever and shadow. His dark hair was damp against his forehead, and his lips moved slightly, forming words I could not hear. I had never been so close to him before. I had never noticed the small scar above his left eyebrow or the way his lashes cast shadows on his cheeks. I did not allow myself to think. I simply acted. I pulled the flask from my apron and lifted his head gently, so gently, cradling it in my palm as I had once cradled Margaret's when she was ill. He stirred, but did not wake, and I pressed the flask to his lips, tilting it slowly, letting the remedy flow into his mouth, drop by drop. "Drink," I whispered, the first word I had ever spoken directly to him. "Please, you must drink." Whether he heard me or whether it was instinct, I do not know, but his throat moved, and he swallowed. I gave him more, and more still, until the flask was empty and my hand was trembling and the valet shifted in his sleep and I knew I had to leave. I slipped from the room like a ghost, my heart in my throat, my hands still warm from where they had touched him. I did not know if what I had done would save him or condemn us both. I only knew that I had tried, and that the trying had changed something inside me that could never be changed back. I returned to the nursery and lay down beside Margaret, who murmured in her sleep and curled closer to me, and I waited for the dawn to bring whatever judgment it would. The hours passed like years. I must have dozed, though I do not remember closing my eyes. For I dreamed of my grandmother standing in her cottage doorway, her gray hair loose around her shoulders, her weathered hands reaching toward me. "Trust what I taught you," she said, and her voice was the wind through the moorland grass. "Trust what you know." I woke to the sound of Margaret stirring beside me, her small hand patting my cheek. "Miss Clara," she whispered, her dark eyes wide with concern. "You were talking in your sleep. You said a name." "Edward. Who is Edward?" My heart stopped. I had not even realized I knew his Christian name, but of course I did. I had heard the servants speak it. I had seen it written on correspondence left carelessly on hall tables. Edward, the name of the man whose life now hung by the thread of my grandmother's remedy. "No one important," I told her, and the lie tasted bitter on my tongue. "Go back to sleep, little one. It is still early." But sleep would not come again. Not for me. I lay in the gray light of dawn and listened to the sounds of the great house awakening around me. Footsteps in corridors, doors opening and closing, the distant clatter of the kitchens beginning their morning work. And beneath it all, a tension that hummed through the walls like the vibration of a struck bell. I did not know what I would find when I descended. I did not know if the remedy had worked or if I had hastened the end I sought to prevent. I only knew that I could not remain in the nursery, pretending ignorance, while the fate of a man I had touched in the darkness hung in the balance. The first light was just touching the windows when I heard the commotion begin. The commotion was unlike anything I had heard in my months at Ashworth Hall. Voices raised in something that was not quite alarm and not quite joy, footsteps running where footsteps never ran. Doors thrown open with abandon in a house where every movement was usually measured and precise. I disentangled myself from Margaret as gently as I could and rose from the bed, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird, desperate for freedom. I found Mrs. Pemberton in the corridor outside the nursery, her usually stern face transformed by an expression I could not immediately identify. It took me a moment to realize it was hope. "Miss Whitmore," she said, and her voice trembled in a way I had never heard before. "The Duke. His fever has broken. The doctors cannot explain it. They are calling it a miracle." I do not remember what I said in response. I do not remember if I said anything at all. I only remember the wave of relief that crashed over me, so powerful that I had to reach for the wall to steady myself. He was alive. The remedy had worked. My grandmother, dead these 8 years, had reached across the veil between worlds and saved a man she had never known. The household erupted into celebration that day, though it was the subdued celebration of an aristocratic estate, expressed in extra rations for the servants and a relaxation of the usual rigid protocols. The Dowager Duchess emerged from her son's chambers with tears streaming down her face, tears she did not bother to hide, and she clasped the hands of every doctor and servant she passed, thanking them for their prayers and their dedication. She did not clasp my hands, she did not even see me, standing in the shadow of the corridor with my secret burning in my chest like a coal that would not cool. And I told myself that was as it should be. I had not acted for recognition. I had acted because a man was dying and I had the power to save him. What did it matter if no one ever knew? But secrets, I would learn, have a way of refusing to stay buried. The Duke's recovery was slow, as recoveries from such fevers often are. For the first week, he was too weak to leave his bed, too weak even to receive the visitors who flooded Ashworth Hall with cards and flowers and inquiries after his health. The doctors who had pronounced him beyond hope now congratulated themselves on their excellent care, attributing his survival to the treatments they had administered and the strength of his constitution. I listened to their self-satisfaction and said nothing, though my silence cost me more than I had expected. Margaret was permitted to visit her uncle on the 3rd day of his recovery, and I accompanied her to his chambers with a heart that would not stop racing. I had not seen him since that night, since I had cradled his head in my palm and pressed the flask to his lips and whispered words I could not take back. I did not know what I would feel when I saw him again. I did not know what I would do. The Duke was propped against a mountain of pillows when we entered, his face still pale but his eyes clear and alert in a way they had not been for weeks. He looked up when the door opened, and for one breathless moment his gaze found mine across the room. Something flickered in those dark eyes, something I could not name, and then Margaret released my hand and ran to his bedside with a cry of joy. "Uncle Edward!" She climbed onto the bed with the fearlessness of childhood, and he caught her in arms that trembled with weakness, but held her tight nonetheless. "I thought you were going to go away like Mama and Papa. I prayed every night that you would stay." I watched him close his eyes and press his lips to the top of her head, and I saw the grief that still lived in him. The grief for his brother and the sister-in-law he had lost, mingled now with something new. Gratitude, perhaps, or wonder at the second chance he had been given. "I am not going anywhere," he said, and his voice was hoarse but steady. "I promise you, Margaret, I will always come back." It was only then that he looked at me again, and this time his gaze did not waver. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and my name in his mouth was like a key turning in a lock. "You have been caring for my niece during my illness. I am told she has been very brave. Lady Margaret has been exemplary, Your Grace." I was surprised my voice did not shake. "She has been my strength as much as I have been hers." He studied me for a long moment, and I felt as though he could see through the careful mask I wore, through the servant's deference and the proper words, to the woman beneath who had touched him in the darkness and changed both our fates. But he only nodded and returned his attention to Margaret, and I told myself the intensity I had seen in his eyes was nothing more than my imagination. The days that followed established a new pattern in the household, one in which the Duke was no longer a distant figure glimpsed in corridors, but a recovering patient who required visitors and entertainment and gentle activity to regain his strength. Margaret insisted on spending hours at his bedside, reading to him from her storybooks or simply sitting beside him while he slept. And because she insisted, I was there as well, a silent presence in the corner of the room with my embroidery or my own book, trying not to look at him, failing utterly. He began to notice me. I do not know when exactly it started, only that I would glance up from my needlework to find his eyes upon me, watching me with an expression I could not decipher. He asked me questions, small things at first, about my family and my education and how I had come to be at Ashworth Hall. I answered as briefly as propriety allowed, afraid of revealing too much, afraid of the warmth that spread through my chest each time he spoke my name. "You have an unusual education for a woman in your position," he observed one afternoon, when Margaret had fallen asleep against his shoulder, and the room was quiet except for the crackling of the fire. "Your father was a schoolteacher, I am told. He was, Your Grace. He believed that knowledge should not be limited by circumstance of birth. A radical notion. But there was no censure in his voice, only curiosity. And your mother? She kept our home and tended our garden. My throat tightened at the memory. She knew the names of every flower and herb that grew in Yorkshire. She said the land spoke to those who listened." He was silent for a moment, his hand absently stroking Margaret's hair. "And do you listen, Miss Whitmore? To the land?" I met his eyes, and the question felt like more than it appeared, like he was asking something else entirely, something neither of us could say aloud. "I try, Your Grace. I try to hear what others might dismiss as silence." Something shifted in his expression, a softening that made him look younger, more vulnerable, more like the man the servants said he had been before grief had hardened him. "I find myself curious about what you hear," he said quietly. "Perhaps, when I am stronger, you will tell me." It was not a command, it was a request, offered almost hesitantly, as though he was not certain he had the right to make it. And I knew in that moment that I was in terrible danger, not of discovery, but of something far more devastating. I was in danger of falling in love with a man I could never have. The Dowager Duchess noticed, of course. Women like her always notice. She summoned me to her private parlor on a gray afternoon 2 weeks after the Duke's fever had broken, and I went with the dread of a prisoner approaching the gallows. The room was elegant and cold, decorated in shades of blue and silver that matched the ice in her eyes, and she did not invite me to sit. Miss Whitmore. She pronounced my name as though it were something distasteful. I have observed that you spend a great deal of time in my son's chambers. I accompany Lady Margaret, Your Grace, as is my duty. Your duty. She repeated the word with delicate contempt. And is it also your duty to engage the Duke in conversation? To draw his attention with your stories and your opinions and your unusual education? I felt the blood rise to my cheeks, but I kept my voice steady. His Grace has been kind enough to take an interest in Lady Margaret's welfare, and by extension, in the woman charged with her care. I have done nothing improper. The Dowager Duchess rose from her chair and crossed to where I stood, her silk skirts whispering against the carpet with each measured step. She was a tall woman, taller than I, and she used her height to full advantage, looking down at me with the cold assessment of a hawk examining a mouse. Let me be clear, Miss Whitmore. My son is the Duke of Ashworth, one of the most eligible men in England. He will marry a woman of appropriate birth and breeding, someone who can give him heirs and manage his household and take her place in society. He will not marry a servant. I never presumed, I began, but she cut me off with a gesture sharp as a blade. You presume every time you speak to him as though you were his equal. You presume every time you meet his eyes. You presume every time you forget your place, which is in the nursery with his niece, not at his bedside playing nursemaid to a man who is not your patient and never will be your husband. The words struck like physical blows, each one precisely aimed at the tender places I had thought I had hidden. I wanted to defend myself. I wanted to tell her that I had no designs on her son, that I knew perfectly well the impossibility of my situation, that I had never for one moment forgotten the vast gulf that separated a duke from a nanny. But another part of me, the part that had been brave enough to defy her orders and administer a forbidden remedy, wanted to ask her what she would have done if she had the power to save someone she loved and the only cost was her pride. I said neither thing. I simply lowered my eyes and murmured, "Yes, Your Grace. I understand, Your Grace." She dismissed me with a wave of her hand, and I returned to the nursery with her words echoing in my mind like the tolling of a funeral bell. She was right, of course. She was right about all of it. I had no business feeling what I felt for the Duke, no business treasuring the moments when his eyes found mine across a crowded room. No business lying awake at night remembering the weight of his head in my palm and the sound of his breathing as he swallowed the medicine that saved his life. I resolved to be more careful. I resolved to remember my place. But fate, as I said at the beginning of this tale, cares nothing for what we intend. It was a week later, on an evening when the snow had finally begun to melt and the first hints of spring were whispering through the Yorkshire air, that the Duke sought me out alone for the first time. I was in the small garden behind the nursery wing, a forgotten corner of the estate where herbs still grew wild despite the cold, gathering chamomile for a tea to help Margaret sleep. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, and I did not hear his footsteps on the gravel path until he spoke my name. Miss Whitmore. I turned so quickly that I nearly dropped my basket, my heart leaping into my throat at the sight of him. He was standing at the entrance to the garden, dressed in a simple coat rather than his usual formal attire, and he looked stronger than he had in weeks. Color returning to his cheeks, his bearing once again that of a man accustomed to command. "Your Grace." I managed a curtsy that was only slightly unsteady. "You should not be out in the cold." The doctors said. The doctors say a great many things. He stepped into the garden, his eyes moving over the herbs that surrounded us, the chamomile and lavender and rosemary, the elderflower that I had not been able to bring myself to look at since the night I had brewed it into a remedy. I find I am tired of listening to doctors. He stopped a few feet from where I stood, close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, close enough that I could smell the scent of him, clean and sharp like pine forests after rain. My grandmother had grown these same herbs, he said quietly. I remember visiting her as a child before she died. She had a garden much like this one. I could not speak. I could only stand there, clutching my basket like a shield, waiting for whatever would come next. She believed in the old remedies, he continued, and his voice was thoughtful, almost distant. The ones the physicians dismiss as superstition. She used to tell me that the earth knew more about healing than any book. I swallowed hard. My grandmother believed the same, Your Grace. Yes. He looked at me then, and there was something in his gaze that made me want to flee and stay forever all at once. I rather thought she might have. The silence stretched between us, filled with everything we were not saying, everything we could not say. I did not know if he suspected the truth. I did not know if this was an accusation or an invitation or simply the curiosity of a man who had come back from the edge of death and wanted to understand why. I should return to Lady Margaret, I finally managed. She will be wondering where I am. Of course. He stepped aside to let me pass, but as I moved past him, his hand caught mine, gentle but firm, holding me in place. Miss Whitmore, Clara, my name, my true name, spoken by his lips. I could not breathe. I do not know what saved me, he said, and his voice was barely above a whisper. But I know it was not the doctors. I know it was something else, something they cannot explain. And I find myself wondering if perhaps it was you. I should have denied it. I should have laughed and called it a fancy born of fever dreams. I should have protected us both from the impossible truth. Instead, I looked into his eyes and said nothing, and my silence was answer enough. He released my hand slowly, his fingers trailing across my palm in a way that left fire in their wake. Then we understand each other, he said, and there was something in his voice that sounded almost like wonder. Good night, Miss Whitmore. Sleep well. He turned and walked away into the gathering darkness, and I stood alone in my grandmother's garden with the last light of sunset fading around me and the certain knowledge that everything had changed. I do not know how long I remained there, the basket of chamomile forgotten at my feet, my hand still burning where he had touched it. The sky deepened from rose to violet to the deep blue of approaching night, and still I could not move. I kept hearing his voice, kept feeling the pressure of his fingers, kept seeing the look in his eyes when he said my name, Clara, as though it were a word he had been waiting his whole life to speak. The cold finally drove me inside, my fingers numb and my cheeks flushed from more than the winter air. I made the tea for Margaret on instinct alone, my mind far away, circling the same impossible questions. He knew. He suspected at least, and he had not condemned me. He had looked at me as though I were something precious, something worth knowing, something more than a servant who had overstepped her bounds. But what did it mean? What could it possibly mean when his mother had made the truth so clear? He was the Duke of Ashworth, and I was no one. He would marry a woman of appropriate birth, and I would remain in the shadows, loving him from a distance that could never be crossed. And yet, he had come to find me in the garden. He had spoken my name. He had held my hand and looked into my eyes and said, "We understand each other," and in those words I heard something that terrified me far more than the Dowager Duchess ever could. I heard hope. Spring arrived at Ashworth Hall with the tentative beauty of a woman unsure of her welcome. The snow retreated in slow surrender, revealing the gardens that had slept beneath its weight, and the first crocuses pushed through the frozen earth like small purple promises of warmth to come. I watched the transformation from the nursery windows with Margaret at my side. and I tried not to think about the man who walked the grounds below, his strength returning more fully each day, his presence becoming impossible to avoid. The Duke had resumed his duties with the determination of a man making up for lost time. He received visitors in his study, attended to correspondence that had accumulated during his illness, and began taking his meals with his mother in the formal dining room rather than in the sanctuary of his chambers. The household settled back into its familiar rhythms, and I told myself that the moment in the garden had been an aberration, a strange interlude born of gratitude and recovery and the lingering effects of fever. I was lying to myself, of course. I knew it even then. He found reasons to visit the nursery now, reasons that had nothing to do with the formality of his previous appearances. He came to read to Margaret before bedtime, his deep voice bringing the stories to life in ways my own never could. He came to take her for walks in the garden, bundled in wool against the lingering chill, and he invited me to accompany them with a casualness that did not quite hide the intention behind it. He came simply to sit by the fire and listen to her chatter about her dolls and her lessons and her dreams, and each time he came, his eyes would find mine across the room, holding questions neither of us dared to ask aloud. The servants noticed. They always notice, those invisible watchers who see everything and say nothing to those above them while trading whispers in the kitchens and the halls. I felt their eyes upon me when I passed, heard the sudden silences that fell when I entered a room, and I knew that my name was being spoken in tones of speculation and scandal. Clara Whitmore, who had somehow captured the attention of the Duke. Clara Whitmore, who did not know her place. Mrs. Pemberton called me to her office on a morning when the rain beat against the windows with the fury of an unwelcome guest. She was a woman of perhaps 50 years, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, who had served the Ashworth family since before I was born. I had thought her harsh when I first arrived, but I had come to understand that her harshness was a kind of armor, protection against the vulnerabilities that servants could not afford to show. "Sit down, Miss Whitmore." She gestured to the chair across from her desk, and I sat, my hands folded in my lap, my heart beating with the steady rhythm of dread. "I wish to speak with you about the Duke." I said nothing. There was nothing I could say that would not condemn me. She studied me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "You are not the first," she said finally. "There have been others before you. Young women who caught his eye, who thought perhaps they might be the one to melt his coldness and claim his heart. He is kind to them, as he is kind to you. He notices them, speaks to them, makes them feel seen, and then he marries someone appropriate, and they are left with nothing but memories and broken hopes." "I understand," I whispered, though the words felt like glass in my throat. "Do you?" She leaned forward, and there was something in her face that was not unkindness, something that might almost have been compassion. "I do not say this to wound you, child. I say it to protect you. The Duke is a good man, perhaps the best I have known in all my years of service. But he is still a duke, bound by obligations you cannot imagine. He will do his duty, as he has always done. And if you allow yourself to love him, you will be the one who pays the price." I thought of the garden, of his hand catching mine, of the way he had said my name like a prayer. I thought of the Dowager Duchess and her cold warnings, of the whispers that followed me through the halls, of the impossible distance between what I felt and what I could ever hope to have. "I do not love him," I said, and the lie was the hardest thing I had ever spoken. Mrs. Pemberton looked at me with eyes that had seen too much to be deceived. "Then you are wiser than I feared," she said quietly. "See that it stays that way." I returned to the nursery and threw myself into my duties with a fervor born of desperation. I taught Margaret her letters with meticulous attention. I took her for walks in the rain, heedless of the mud that stained our hems. I read to her until my voice grew hoarse and my eyes burned from the strain of candlelight. I did everything I could to fill the hours with activity, to leave no space for the thoughts that crept in like shadows when I was still. But the Duke would not let me retreat. He came to the nursery that very evening, as though he sensed my resolve and was determined to test it. Margaret was already asleep, her small form curled beneath the blankets, and I was sitting by the fire with my mending when I heard his footsteps in the corridor. I knew it was him before he appeared in the doorway. I had learned the sound of his walk, the way I had learned the rhythm of my own heartbeat. Miss Whitmore. He stepped into the room, closing the door behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo in the silence. I hoped I might find you awake. Your Grace. I rose from my chair, my mending falling forgotten to the floor. Lady Margaret is sleeping. If you wish to see her. I did not come to see Margaret. He moved closer, and the firelight cast dancing shadows across his face, illuminating the plains and hollows that I had memorized without meaning to. I came to see you. My breath caught. That is not appropriate, Your Grace. No. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that I could see the pulse beating in his throat, the tension in the set of his jaw. It is not appropriate. Nothing about this is appropriate. And yet I find I cannot stay away. The confession hung in the air between us, more dangerous than any touch, more intimate than any embrace. I should have told him to leave. I should have reminded him of his duty, his station, the impossibility of everything he was implying. But the words would not come. I could only stand there trembling as he looked at me with eyes that held everything he could not say. I have tried, he continued, and his voice was rough, stripped of the polish that usually characterized it. I have tried to forget the garden, to convince myself that it was nothing, that you are nothing more than a servant in my household. But every time I close my eyes, I see your face. Every time I enter a room, I look for you. You have taken up residence in my thoughts, Clara Whitmore, and I do not know how to evict you. You must. The words came out as a whisper, broken and desperate. Your mother. My mother wants me to marry Lady Helena Ashford, whose father owns half of Northumberland and whose bloodline stretches back to the Conquest. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. She has made it clear that my duty is to secure the succession, to produce heirs, to continue the legacy that my brother was supposed to carry. And I have always done my duty. I have always been the second son who never expected to inherit, who was content to live in his brother's shadow. But my brother is dead, and I am the Duke, and I am so very tired of being what everyone expects me to be. I felt tears pricking at the corners of my eyes, tears I refused to let fall. What are you saying, Your Grace? Edward. His name came out like a plea. When we are alone, when it is just the two of us in the darkness, call me Edward. I cannot. You can. He took another step closer, and now I could feel the warmth radiating from his body, could smell the familiar scent of him that haunted my dreams. You can do anything you choose, Clara. You proved that the night you saved my life. The words struck me like a blow. I did not. Do not lie to me. His voice was gentle but firm. I know it was you. I have known since I woke from the fever and saw the fear in your eyes, the relief you could not quite hide. I have known since I asked the doctors what they had done and realized that nothing they described could have brought me back from where I was. It was you, your remedy, your courage, your hands that held me in the darkness and gave me something to live for. The tears fell then, slipping down my cheeks despite my best efforts to stop them. I could not let you die, I whispered. I could not stand by and do nothing when I knew there was a chance. Even if it cost me everything, it will not cost you everything. He reached out, his fingers brushing the tears from my face with a tenderness that shattered something inside me. It will cost you nothing, because I will not allow it. You saved my life, Clara. Do you think I could ever forget that? Do you think I could ever repay that debt by letting anyone harm you? This is not about debt. I caught his hand before I could stop myself, pressing it against my cheek, holding it there like something precious. This is about love, and love between us is impossible. He was silent for a long moment, his eyes searching my face in the flickering firelight. Then his other hand came up to cup my chin, tilting my face toward his, and I saw something in his expression that made my heart stop. "Nothing is impossible," he said quietly. "I am the Duke of Ashworth. I can do whatever I choose, and what I choose is you." He kissed me then, and the world fell away. It was not the kiss I had imagined in my foolish daydreams, not the gentle brush of lips that I had thought might be my first taste of love. It was fierce and desperate, a claiming and a surrender all at once, and I met it with everything I had, everything I had been hiding, everything I had tried so hard to deny. His arms came around me, pulling me against him, and I felt the rapid beat of his heart through the layers of fabric that separated us, matching the wild rhythm of my own. When we finally broke apart, both of us gasping, I saw that his composure was as shattered as mine. His dark hair had fallen across his forehead. His eyes were wild, and his hands trembled where they rested on my waist. "I love you," he said, and the words were raw, unpolished, utterly unlike the measured speech of a duke. "I do not know when it began or how it happened, but I love you, Clara Whitmore, and I will find a way for us to be together. I swear it on my life, on the life you gave back to me." I wanted to believe him. God, how I wanted to believe him. But I was the granddaughter of a village healer, a servant in his house, a woman with nothing but her wits and her heart to offer. And he was the Duke of Ashworth, bound by centuries of tradition, by the expectations of a society that would never accept what he was proposing. "Your mother will never allow it," I said, and my voice broke on the words. "Society will never accept it. You will be ruined, Edward. Everything you have worked for, everything your family has built, let it burn." His eyes blazed with a conviction I had never seen in him before. "Let it all burn, if the price of keeping it is losing you." He kissed me again, softer this time, a promise rather than a demand, and I let myself fall into it, let myself believe, just for a moment, that love could conquer all the obstacles that stood between us. I should have known better. I should have remembered that the world does not bend to the wishes of those who love against the rules. But in that moment, with his arms around me and his lips on mine and his voice in my ear swearing eternal devotion, I forgot everything except the feel of being held by a man who had chosen me above all others. The sound of footsteps in the corridor brought us crashing back to reality. We sprang apart just as the door opened, and there in the doorway stood the Dowager Duchess, her face white with shock and fury, her eyes taking in the scene before her with the precision of a general surveying a battlefield. "I see," she said, and her voice was ice, was death, was the end of everything I had allowed myself to hope for. "I see exactly what has been happening in my house. Mother." Edward stepped forward, his hand reaching for mine even as he faced her. "Let me explain." "There is nothing to explain." She cut him off with a gesture that brooked no argument. "I have eyes, Edward. I have seen the way you look at this woman, the way you have been neglecting your duties to spend time in the nursery. I had hoped I was wrong. I had hoped you had more sense than to throw away everything for a servant. She is not just a servant." His voice was steady, but I could hear the anger beneath it, the coiled tension of a man prepared to fight. "She saved my life, Mother. When your doctors had given up, when everyone had accepted that I would die, she found a way to bring me back. She deserves nothing." The Dowager Duchess turned her gaze to me, and I felt it like a physical blow, cold and cutting and utterly without mercy. She is a schemer who saw an opportunity and took it. She administered some concoction without permission, without medical supervision, and she has used that accident of fortune to worm her way into your affections. It was not an accident. I heard my own voice, small but steady, rising up from somewhere deep inside me. It was knowledge. Knowledge passed down from my grandmother. Knowledge that your physicians were too proud to consider. I saved your son because I could not bear to watch him die, not because I wanted anything from him. And yet, here you stand, in his arms, in my house. Her lip curled with contempt. Tell me, Miss Whitmore, what exactly were you planning? Marriage? You must know that is impossible. A duke cannot marry a servant. It would be the scandal of the century. Then let it be a scandal. Edward moved to stand beside me, his hand finding mine and holding it firmly. I do not care what society thinks. I do not care about tradition or propriety or any of the rules that have governed this family for generations. I care about Clara. I love her, and I intend to make her my wife. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of rain against the windows. The Dowager Duchess stared at her son as though she had never seen him before, as though he had become a stranger wearing a familiar face. "Then you leave me no choice," she said finally, and her voice was terrifyingly calm. "Miss Whitmore, you will pack your things tonight. You will leave this house at first light, and you will never see my son again." "I will not allow it," Edward said, but his mother was already turning away, already dismissing us both with the certainty of a woman who had never been denied anything in her life. "You will not have a choice," she said over her shoulder. "By morning, the world will know exactly what kind of woman has been caring for your niece. I will make certain of it." The door closed behind her, and Edward and I stood alone in the nursery, with the wreckage of our hopes scattered around us like autumn leaves in a storm. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the darkness of my small room, my bag packed and waiting by the door, and I listened to the rain that continued to fall as though the heavens themselves were weeping for what we had lost. Edward had tried to comfort me after his mother left, had sworn again that he would not let her drive me away, but I had seen the fear in his eyes, the knowledge that his mother held weapons he could not easily counter. She was the Dowager Duchess, connected to every great family in England, capable of destroying reputations with a whispered word in the right ear. If she chose to ruin me, there would be nothing either of us could do to stop her. The hours crawled past like wounded things, and when the first gray light of dawn began to seep through my window, I rose and dressed with the mechanical movements of a woman walking to her own execution. I would go as she had commanded. I would leave Ashworth Hall and Edward and Margaret and everything I had come to love, because staying would only make things worse. If I remained, the Dowager Duchess would make good on her threats. She would spread lies about me, paint me as a fortune hunter, a seductress, a scheming servant who had used witchcraft to ensnare her son. She would destroy not only my reputation, but Edward's as well, and I could not bear to be the cause of his ruin. I was fastening my cloak when I heard the soft knock at my door. My heart leaped, thinking it might be Edward come to say goodbye. But when I opened the door, I found Margaret standing in the corridor, her small face pale and streaked with tears, her nightgown trailing on the cold floor. Miss Clara. Her voice was barely a whisper, broken by the sobs she was trying to suppress. "Please do not go, please." I heard grandmother talking to the servants. She said you were leaving and never coming back. She said you were a wicked woman who had done bad things. But that is not true, is it? You are not wicked. You are the kindest person I have ever known. I dropped to my knees and gathered her into my arms, holding her small, trembling body against my chest as my own tears finally broke free. "Oh, my darling girl." I pressed my lips to her hair, breathing in the scent of lavender soap and childhood innocence. "I am so sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen. I never meant to hurt you. Then stay." She pulled back to look at me, her dark eyes fierce with a determination that seemed far too old for her 6 years. "Stay and marry Uncle Edward. He loves you. I know he does. He looks at you the way Papa used to look at Mama, before she went to heaven. And you love him too. I can see it. Why does it matter what Grandmother thinks?" The simplicity of her question broke something inside me. Why did it matter? Why should the opinions of a cold, proud woman determine the course of our lives? But Margaret was a child, innocent of the ways of the world, and I could not explain to her the complexities of class and society and the 1,000 unwritten rules that governed who could love whom. "It is not that simple, sweetheart." I cupped her face in my hands, memorizing every feature, knowing that I might never see her again. "There are rules, you see. Rules that say a woman like me cannot marry a man like your uncle. If I stay, I will cause trouble for him, for you, for everyone. And I could not bear that. Rules are stupid." She said it with the absolute conviction of childhood, and despite everything, I felt a watery laugh escape my lips. If I were the Duchess, I would make new rules, better rules, rules that let people be happy. "If only you were the Duchess," I whispered. "If only it were that simple." We held each other in the cold corridor as the dawn light strengthened around us, and I let myself pretend, just for a moment, that I did not have to go. But the sound of footsteps on the stairs reminded me that the household was waking, that the day was beginning, that my time at Ashworth Hall was coming to an end. "I have to go now," I said, gently releasing her. "But I want you to remember something, Margaret. I want you to remember that you are brave and kind and capable of anything you set your mind to. Do not let anyone tell you otherwise. Do not let anyone make you small." She threw her arms around my neck one last time, holding on with a strength that belied her tiny frame. "I will remember," she promised, "and I will never forget you, Miss Clara. Never." I picked up my bag and walked down the corridor, down the stairs, through the great halls that I had come to know so well over these past months. The servants I passed looked away. Whether from shame or solidarity, I could not tell. Only Mrs. Pemberton met my eyes, and in her gaze I saw something that might have been respect. I was nearly at the front door when I heard Edward's voice. "Clara, stop!" I turned, and there he was, striding across the entrance hall with a look on his face that I had never seen before. It was not the cold reserve of the Duke, nor the tender vulnerability of the man who had kissed me in the firelight. It was something fiercer, something almost wild, the look of a man who had made a decision and would not be swayed. "You cannot leave," he said, reaching me in 3 long strides. "I will not allow it. Edward, please." I felt the tears threatening again, and I blinked them back with all the strength I had left. "You must not do this. My mother has no power over this decision." He took my bag from my hand and set it on the floor, then caught both my hands in his, holding them against his chest so I could feel the rapid beat of his heart. "I have spent the night thinking, Clara, thinking about duty and love and what kind of man I want to be, and I have realized something." "What?" The word came out as barely a breath. "I have spent my entire life doing what was expected of me, being the second son, the spare, the one who would never inherit. When my brother died, I became someone I did not recognize, someone who buried his grief beneath obligation and told himself that duty was enough. But it is not enough. It will never be enough. I do not want to be the Duke who did his duty and died alone and unloved. I want to be the man who chose happiness. I want to be the man who chose you." "Your mother will destroy us," I whispered. "She will tell everyone. Let her tell them." His eyes blazed with conviction. "Let her tell the whole of London that the Duke of Ashworth fell in love with the woman who saved his life. Let her tell them that I chose a healer's granddaughter over a baron's daughter. Do you know what I think will happen? I think some will mock us. Some will shun us. But others, Clara, others will see the truth. They will see that love is worth more than bloodlines, that courage is worth more than convention. You cannot know that, I protested, even as hope began to flicker in my chest like a candle flame refusing to be extinguished. You cannot know how society will react. No. He lifted my hands to his lips, pressing a kiss to each palm. I cannot know. But I know how I will react if you walk out that door. I will spend the rest of my life regretting that I let you go. I will marry some suitable woman and father, suitable heirs, and become exactly the cold, distant duke that everyone expects me to be. And every night, until the day I die, I will think of you and wonder what might have been. The tears were falling now, and I did not try to stop them. Edward, marry me, Clara. He dropped to one knee right there in the entrance hall, in full view of any servant who might be watching, with no ring and no formal proposal, and nothing but the desperate sincerity in his eyes. Marry me and be my Duchess. Help me raise Margaret. Help me be the man I want to be instead of the man the world demands. I love you. I have never said those words to anyone, and I will never say them to anyone else. Please, say yes. I looked down at him. This man, who had been a stranger only months ago, who had become the center of my world without my permission or understanding. I thought of all the reasons I should refuse: his mother's hatred, society's judgment, the impossible gap between who I was and who I would have to become. I thought of my grandmother, who had lived and died in obscurity, whose knowledge had been dismissed by everyone except those desperate enough to try it. I thought of my father, who had believed that birth should not determine worth, who had given me an education that had shaped everything I was. And I thought of Edward, who had looked past my station and seen me, who had come back from death and chosen life, chosen love, chosen the uncertain path over the safe one. Yes, I said, and the word was a leap of faith, a surrender, a beginning. Yes, Edward, I will marry you. He rose to his feet and swept me into his arms, lifting me off the ground and spinning me around as though we were children at a country fair rather than a duke and a servant in the grand entrance of an aristocratic estate. I clung to him and laughed and cried and let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, this impossible thing could actually happen. The sound of slow applause broke through our joy. We turned to find the Dowager Duchess standing on the staircase, her face a mask of cold fury, her hands moving together in a mockery of celebration. How touching, she said, her voice dripping with contempt. The Duke of Ashworth proposing to a servant in his own entrance hall. I am certain the scandal sheets will find it absolutely delightful. Mother. Edward set me down, but kept his arm around my waist, a declaration of intent that could not be misunderstood. I have made my decision. Clara will be my wife. You can accept that, or you can leave Ashworth Hall, but you will not change my mind. Leave. She laughed, a sharp, brittle sound. I am the Dowager Duchess. This has been my home for 30 years. I will not be driven out by some scheming girl who has bewitched my son. No one is driving you out. Edward's voice was steady, but I could feel the tension in his body, the effort it cost him to remain calm. I am asking you to accept the woman I love. Is that truly so impossible? Something flickered in the Dowager Duchess's eyes, something that might have been pain beneath the anger. Your father would never have done this, she said, and her voice cracked slightly on the words. He understood his duty. He understood what it meant to be an Ashworth. Father married for duty, Edward replied quietly, and he was miserable every day of his life. He died in this house surrounded by wealth and title and everything society deemed important. And he had no one who truly loved him. Not even you, Mother. Certainly not you. The silence that followed was profound. I watched the Dowager Duchess's face cycle through shock, fury, and something that looked almost like grief before settling into a cold blankness that revealed nothing. "You will regret this," she said finally. "Both of you. Society will never accept her. She will be a laughingstock, and by extension, so will you. Everything the Ashworth name represents will be diminished. Then let it be diminished." Edward drew me closer, and I felt the warmth of his body against mine, the steady rhythm of his breathing that matched my own. Let it be diminished, if the price of keeping it is my soul. I would rather be a happy man with a tarnished name than a miserable one with a spotless reputation. The Dowager Duchess stared at us for a long moment, and I thought I saw something shift in her expression, something that was not quite acceptance, but perhaps the beginning of resignation. Then she turned and walked back up the stairs, her silk skirts whispering against the marble steps, her back straight and proud as it had always been. "She will come around," Edward murmured against my hair. "Eventually. She is proud and stubborn, but she is not cruel. She will see that you make me happy, and in time she will accept it." I was not as certain as he was, but I did not say so. Instead, I turned in his arms and looked up at the face of the man who had just upended his entire world for me. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now?" He smiled, and it transformed his face, making him look younger, lighter, like a man who had set down a burden he had carried for far too long. "Now I send for the priest. Now I begin arrangements for our wedding. Now I introduce you to Margaret as her future aunt." He paused, his expression softening. "Now I kiss the woman I love." And he did. The days that followed were a whirlwind of preparations and confrontations, of joy and anxiety intermingled like threads in a tapestry. Edward was true to his word, sending for the family solicitor and the local vicar, making arrangements for a wedding that would take place in the small chapel on the Ashworth estate. He wrote letters to his closest friends, informing them of his intentions, and received responses that ranged from shocked congratulations to ominous warnings. Margaret was overjoyed, as I had known she would be. She attached herself to me with renewed fervor, calling me Aunt Clara before the wedding had even taken place, planning elaborate games in which we would all live happily ever after in the great house forever. Her innocent enthusiasm was a balm to my anxious heart, a reminder of why I had come to Ashworth Hall in the first place, and what truly mattered beneath all the complications of class and society. The Dowager Duchess maintained a frosty distance, taking her meals in her chambers, refusing to participate in any of the preparations. Edward visited her daily, returning with a tension in his shoulders that he tried to hide from me, and I knew that their conversations were painful for both of them. She was his mother, after all. He had loved her once, before duty and expectation had built walls between them, and I suspected part of him still hoped for her blessing, even though he claimed not to need it. The scandal, when it came, was exactly as devastating as the Dowager Duchess had promised. It began with whispers in the neighboring estates, rumors that spread like wildfire through the drawing rooms and ballrooms of Yorkshire society. The Duke of Ashworth was marrying his niece's Nanny. The Duke of Ashworth had fallen prey to a fortune-hunting servant. The Duke of Ashworth had lost his mind during his illness and was now making decisions that would shame his family for generations. Invitations to social events were quietly withdrawn. Former acquaintances became suddenly unavailable for visits. Even the servants at Ashworth Hall seemed divided, some loyal to Edward and his choice, others clearly aligned with the Dowager Duchess and her disapproval. I bore it as best I could, reminding myself that Edward had chosen this, that he had known what it would cost and deemed me worth the price. But there were nights when the weight of it all pressed down on me like a physical thing, when I lay awake in the darkness and wondered if I was destroying the man I loved in the name of a happiness that might prove fleeting. It was on one such night, 3 days before our wedding, that everything changed. The knock on my chamber door came well past midnight when the house had fallen silent, and only the wind remained awake, whispering secrets against the window panes. I had been sitting by the dying fire, unable to sleep, my mind churning with all the ways our story might end in tragedy. When I opened the door, I expected to find Edward, come to offer comfort as he had so many nights before. Instead, I found the Dowager Duchess. She stood in the corridor with a single candle in her hand, her silver hair loose around her shoulders in a way I had never seen, her face stripped of its usual imperious mask. She looked older in that moment, and smaller, and more human than I had ever imagined her to be. "May I come in?" Her voice was quiet, almost hesitant, nothing like the cold commands I had grown accustomed to hearing from her lips. I stepped aside without a word, too shocked to do anything else. She entered my small chamber, her eyes moving over the modest furnishings, the narrow bed, the few possessions I had brought with me to Ashworth Hall. She set her candle on the table by the window and turned to face me. "I could not sleep," she said. "I have not slept properly in weeks, if I'm honest. Every time I close my eyes, I see my son's face when he looks at you. I see the way he smiles, the way he stands straighter, the way he seems to have shed years of grief and obligation in a matter of months. And I ask myself the same question over and over until I think I might go mad." "What question, Your Grace?" She was silent for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. Was I wrong? I did not know how to answer. I did not know if there was an answer that would satisfy either of us. So I simply waited, watching as she gathered herself, as the candle flame flickered and danced in the draught from the window. "I married the previous Duke when I was 17 years old," she continued, and her words had the quality of a confession, long held and finally released. "It was arranged, of course. My family needed the connection. His family needed an heir. I was told that duty was the highest virtue, that love was a luxury the aristocracy could not afford, that my feelings were irrelevant compared to the preservation of the family name." She paused, her eyes distant, fixed on something I could not see. And I believed them. I believed them so completely that I forgot I had ever wanted anything else. "Your Grace," I began, but she held up a hand to stop me. "Let me finish. I have never spoken of this to anyone, not to my husband, who went to his grave without ever knowing what I might have felt for him if circumstances had been different. Not to my sons, whom I raised to follow the same rules that had shaped my own life. I have carried this silence for 40 years, and I find I can no longer bear the weight of it." She moved to the window and looked out at the darkness beyond, her reflection ghostly in the glass. "I did love someone once," she said quietly, "before my marriage. A young man who worked in my father's stables. He had no money, no title, nothing to recommend him except a kind heart and a smile that made me feel as though the sun had come out after a long winter. We met in secret, talked of impossible futures, allowed ourselves to dream. And when my father discovered us, he sent the young man away and arranged my betrothal to the Duke within the month. I felt something shift inside me, a crack in the wall I had built between myself and this formidable woman. "I am sorry," I said, and I meant it. She turned to face me, and I saw that there were tears on her cheeks, silent tears that she did not try to hide. "I have spent my entire life telling myself that my father was right, that I was better off with a duke than a stable hand, that the comfort and security I gained were worth the love I lost. But when I look at my son, when I see the way he defies everything I taught him for the chance to be happy with you, I find myself wondering if I was simply too much of a coward to fight for what I wanted." "You were not a coward," I said softly. "You were young, and you were alone, and you did what you believed was right. That is not cowardice. That is survival." She studied me for a long moment, and something in her expression changed, softened, became almost tender. "You are not what I expected," she admitted. "When I first learned of Edward's attachment to you, I assumed you were like the others, the women who see a title and a fortune and care nothing for the man beneath. But you are not like them at all, are you? I love your son," I said simply. I loved him before I knew what it would cost, and I love him still, knowing everything it will take from both of us. I cannot offer him bloodlines or connections or a spotless reputation. I can only offer him my heart and my loyalty and whatever healing I carry in my hands. The Dowager Duchess was silent for a long moment. Then she did something I never could have predicted. She reached out and took my hands in hers, her grip surprisingly strong, her skin cool and dry against my own. "I came here tonight to tell you something," she said. "Something I should have said weeks ago when Edward first announced his intentions. I came to tell you that I was wrong. Your Grace, let me finish," she said again. And there was a hint of her old imperiousness in the words, though it was tempered now by something warmer. "I was wrong to treat you as an enemy. I was wrong to threaten you, to try to drive you away, to let my fear of scandal overcome my love for my son." She paused, her grip tightening on my hands. "I was wrong, and I am sorry, more sorry than I know how to express." I felt the tears spilling down my own cheeks now, mirroring hers. Two women weeping in a candlelit room over wounds that spanned generations. "You do not owe me an apology, Your Grace. You were protecting your family. I understand that. I would have done the same." "Perhaps." She released my hands and reached up to brush the tears from my face with a gentleness I had not known she possessed. But I was protecting the wrong things. I was protecting a name, a reputation, a place in society that means nothing if it comes at the cost of happiness. Edward tried to tell me that, and I would not listen. It took weeks of watching him prepare to marry you, of seeing the light in his eyes that I never saw when he looked at Lady Helena or any of the other suitable candidates I paraded before him, to understand what I had almost destroyed. "What are you saying?" I whispered. "I am saying," she replied, and a small smile touched her lips, the first genuine smile I had ever seen from her, "that I would be honored to welcome you as my daughter, if you will have me as a mother, despite everything I have done." I did not trust myself to speak. I simply stepped forward and embraced her, this proud, wounded woman who had carried her own lost love like a stone in her heart for 4 decades, and I felt her arms come around me in return, stiff at first, and then softening, holding me as though I were something precious she had almost thrown away. We stood there for a long time, two women from different worlds, finding common ground in the universal language of love and loss and the courage to begin again. When we finally pulled apart, both of us were smiling through our tears. "There is something else," the Dowager Duchess said, wiping her eyes with a handkerchief she produced from her sleeve. "Something I discovered when I began to investigate your background more thoroughly, hoping to find evidence that would discredit you in Edward's eyes." She paused, and there was a strange expression on her face, something between chagrin and wonder. "I found the opposite instead." "What do you mean?" "Your grandmother, the healer." She hesitated, then continued. "I made inquiries in the village where she lived, spoke to people who remembered her. Do you know what they told me?" I shook my head, my heart beginning to beat faster. "They told me that she saved dozens of lives over the years. Fevers that the doctors could not break, infections that should have been fatal, children who were given up for dead and yet survived because she knew which herbs to use and how to use them." She looked at me with something like respect in her eyes. "Your grandmother was not a superstitious peasant peddling folk remedies. She was a healer of genuine skill and knowledge, and her legacy lives on in you. You saved my son's life, Clara, not through luck or accident, but through wisdom passed down through generations. I was a fool to dismiss that wisdom simply because it did not come from a medical college. I thought of my grandmother then, her weathered hands teaching mine which plants to gather and how to prepare them, her voice telling me that the earth knew secrets the learned men would never discover. I thought of her dying in her small cottage, surrounded by the herbs she had tended all her life, with no one to carry on her knowledge except a granddaughter who had been sent away to work in a great house far from home. She would have been proud, I said softly, to know that her remedies saved a duke. The Dowager Duchess smiled again, and this time it reached her eyes. She should be proud, and so should you. Now, she said, her tone becoming brisk in a way that was almost comforting in its familiarity, we have a wedding to prepare for. I have been absent from the planning for far too long. There are details to attend to, guests to invite, arrangements to be made. If you are to become the Duchess of Ashworth, we must ensure that you do so properly. She swept toward the door, every inch the Dowager Duchess once more, but she paused on the threshold and looked back at me. Thank you, she said quietly, for loving my son enough to fight for him, for being brave enough to save him when no one else could, for giving me a second chance to be the mother I should have been all along. Then she was gone, leaving me alone with the dying candle and the first stirrings of a hope I had not dared to feel. The wedding took place 3 days later, on a morning when the spring sun shone with a warmth that felt like benediction. The small chapel on the Ashworth estate was filled with flowers from the garden, white roses and lavender, and the wild herbs that had saved Edward's life, woven together in arrangements that spoke of love and healing and new beginnings. Margaret served as my flower girl, scattering petals down the aisle with the serious concentration of a child entrusted with an important mission. She wore a dress of pale blue silk that the Dowager Duchess herself had chosen, and when she reached the altar, she turned and gave me a smile so radiant that I felt my heart might burst. Edward waited for me at the front of the chapel, dressed in his finest attire, his dark hair gleaming in the sunlight that streamed through the stained glass windows. But it was his eyes that I remember most clearly, the way they held mine as I walked toward him, the way they shone with a love so pure and fierce that it banished every lingering doubt. The Dowager Duchess sat in the front pew, her posture as straight and proud as ever. But when I glanced at her during the ceremony, I saw that she was weeping. Not tears of grief or anger, but tears of joy, the tears of a woman who had finally allowed herself to believe in the possibility of happiness. The vicar spoke the words that would bind us together, words that had been spoken in this chapel for generations, joining Ashworths to their chosen partners in the sight of God and man. When Edward slipped the ring onto my finger, a simple band of gold that had belonged to his grandmother, I felt the weight of it like a promise, a vow that went beyond the formal declarations we had just made. I now pronounce you husband and wife, the vicar said, and Edward kissed me, soft and sweet and full of everything we had fought for. And somewhere behind us, Margaret cheered, and the servants applauded, and even the Dowager Duchess allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The reception that followed was smaller than what might have been expected for a ducal wedding, but it was perfect in its intimacy. Those who came were those who truly mattered, friends who had stood by Edward despite the scandal, servants who had watched our love story unfold and chosen to celebrate rather than condemn. We danced in the great hall where I had once passed through as an invisible presence, and Edward held me close and whispered words of love against my hair, and I knew that I had found my home at last. It was late in the evening, when the guests had departed and Margaret had been carried to bed by a nursemaid who winked at me as she passed, that the Dowager Duchess approached us one final time. "I have something for you," she said, and she pressed a small velvet box into my hands. A wedding gift. I opened it to find a brooch of exquisite beauty, a cluster of diamonds surrounding a single sapphire that caught the candlelight and scattered it like stars. "It belonged to my mother," the Dowager Duchess explained. "She gave it to me on my wedding day, and I had always intended to give it to Edward's wife. I paused when I learned of your engagement, uncertain whether you deserved something so precious." She met my eyes with an honesty that I had come to cherish. "I see now that I was asking the wrong question. It is not whether you deserve it. It is whether anything in my possession could possibly be precious enough to express what you have given my family." I embraced her then. This woman who had been my adversary and had become something I never expected, a mother, a friend, an ally. "Thank you," I whispered, "for everything." The months that followed our wedding were not without challenges. Society did not immediately embrace the former Nanny who had become the Duchess of Ashworth. There were whispers and snubs and doors that remained closed to us. But there were also surprises, families who welcomed us because they had heard the story of how I had saved Edward's life. Young women who saw in our union a hope that they too might marry for love rather than convenience. I established a small clinic in the village near Ashworth Hall, using my grandmother's knowledge to help those who could not afford physicians or who had been failed by them. The Dowager Duchess, to my eternal amazement, became my most vocal supporter, telling anyone who would listen about the miraculous cure that had saved her son and the wisdom of the woman who had administered it. Edward thrived in his role as Duke, but it was a different kind of thriving than anyone had expected. He opened his lands to new farming methods, invested in schools for the children of his tenants, and earned a reputation as a reformer who cared more for the welfare of his people than for the approval of his peers. He credited me with teaching him that rules were made to be questioned, that tradition was only valuable if it served the living rather than imprisoning them. And Margaret grew, as children do, into a young woman of fierce intelligence and fiercer compassion. She never forgot the lessons I had taught her, the lessons about bravery and kindness and the importance of making new rules when the old ones failed to serve. When she came of age, she insisted on learning my grandmother's remedies, carrying the knowledge forward into yet another generation. I am writing this now, many years later, in the same room where I first administered my grandmother's remedy to a dying man. The window looks out over gardens that bloom with healing herbs, planted by my own hands and tended by those who have come to learn what I know. Edward sits beside the fire, his hair touched with gray now, his face lined with the marks of a life fully lived. Margaret visits with her own children, who call me Grandmother Clara and beg me for stories about the old days. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of the evening, I think about the path that brought me here. The orphaned girl from the Yorkshire hills who came to a great house as a servant and left it as a duchess. The woman who dared to challenge the greatest medical minds in England with nothing but faith in her grandmother's wisdom. The heart that learned to love against all reason and found itself loved in return. I have been asked over the years what the secret is. How did I know the remedy would work? How did I find the courage to risk everything? How did I believe that love could overcome the barriers of class and convention? I never know quite how to answer. I suppose the truth is that I did not know. I did not know anything for certain. I only knew that a man was dying, and I had the power to save him. I only knew that my heart recognized something in his eyes that my mind could not explain. I only knew that some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds seem impossible, even when the world tells you to accept defeat. My grandmother used to say that the best remedies are not found in bottles or books. They are found in the courage to try when others have given up, in the love that refuses to let go, in the faith that healing is always possible if only we are willing to believe. She was right, as she was right about so many things. And I, Clara Whitmore Ashworth, Duchess of Ashworth, healer and wife and mother and grandmother, am living proof of it. The candle burns low now, and Edward is calling me to bed. Tomorrow there will be patients to see, grandchildren to spoil, a life to continue living. But tonight, I will close this journal and go to the man who chose me above everything, and I will thank whatever providence brought us together. For in the end, that is the only remedy that truly matters. Love, freely given and gratefully received. It saved a dying heir all those years ago, and it saved me too.